Or good afternoon. How are you guys? It's a long week, isn't it? Feels like you've been here for a month probably walked 100 miles. You guys are tired, but you're here on a Friday afternoon. I really admire that. I admire your commitment to learning. So welcome to this session. This is exam prep, AZ-203. We're gonna have a lot of fun. We do only have 45 minutes here, so we are gonna move pretty quick, and I'll hope to do some Q&A throughout this session. If we need more time, I will hang out after the session, either kind of in here or outside the room. And I'm hoping in this session to give you a lot of concrete real-world examples, things that you can take away, to give you a lot of value in terms of figuring out how to tackle this particular exam. How many people have actually taken an exam so far this week? A few people? All right, congratulations. And thanks a lot for participating. Anybody that hasn't ever taken an exam before for Microsoft? Okay, just a handful, good. So what I'm gonna do today is kind of take you through the basics and then also give you some study tips. So let's just get right into it. Key takeaways for this one are going to be a handful of things. Number one, obviously help you prepare for the exam, but really give you a breakdown of what's on the test, what you need to be prepared to see on the test, what stuff might come up, and then also some study tactics. I wanna give you guys some things that you can walk away with in terms of building a game plan for preparing for this exam. So the AZ-203 it's kind of a weird thing, right? It's like, why is it 203? Why isn't it 200? Why isn't it 201? Why isn't it 202? So the AZ-203 in its current form is just one exam. Originally, the intent was to have an AZ-200 and a 201, so you'd have to take 2 tests to get the certification. Microsoft decided that that was a little bit too much, and so they decided, all right, let's make it one exam. So there was an AZ-202 that was a transition exam, but that one is also retired. So 200, 201, 202 are retired. 203 is the current one that we're working with. So one test gets you certified as an Azure Associate Certified Developer. Now this week, you guys have probably been looking at certifications a lot, but just in case you're not aware of the breakdown, here's kind of the current structure, right? We've got the fundamental certification, AZ-900. That kind of feeds into some of the other associate level certifications, right? But there is no prerequisites for any of the associate level or even the fundamentals, right? So you can just jump right in to the developer associate certification if you like to. If you want to feel comfortable by taking the AZ-900 first, the fundamentals exam, that's a good idea. It's optional, right? Although that is a good set of content for anybody working in IT, whether it's pre-sales engineers, project managers, developers, systems integrators, systems engineers, administrators, all that kind of stuff. Now you'll notice on this screen showing us the role-based certifications, these associate level certs feed right in kind of to an expert level. So notice the dotted lines going from kind of our optional certification into these associate level ones, and then we've got a solid line from either Microsoft Certified Azure Administrator Associates or Developer Associate, which we're talking about today. Those feed into Azure DevOps Engineer Expert Certification. So AZ-400, the DevOps certification, that does require a prerequisite. Pretty much the only Azure exam that requires that. So if you do this exam here, you get certified as an Azure developer, you'll be set up to move on to that AZ-400 if that's what you want to do. All right, so this exam is aimed obviously at developers. However, there is going to be some infrastructure stuff that they expect us to do. So we do have to understand what are the tools and services, but also what are some of the infrastructure services. So there is a handful of requirements to understand IaaS resources. We'll talk about all of that, but essentially this is the audience profile, folks that are working with other people in IT to deliver applications into the cloud. All right, and so these are the pillars, essentially, that we're gonna dive into in more depth, but these are the pillars that make up the content for this exam. So there's quite a bit here. And to be honest with you guys, I've been doing certifications for about 20 years. I started way back in the old days in the NT4 MCSE stuff. And the exams, the way they're done now, very good. Very fair, right? They're not gonna try to trick you. There's less ambiguity. So it's like if you know what you're doing, you're in good shape. But I will say that this exam is definitely, does test your knowledge pretty good. But I think if you go through the process of kind of attacking it in the way that we're going to cover, understanding these concepts, you'll be in good shape. All right, so number one, kind of taking a look at the top left here on this slide, we've got Azure Infrastructure as a Service. and compute solutions. So, a lot of times when you're developing applications, you've got an infrastructure team that deals with this. A lot of the times you don't have to deal with the VMs and things like that. However, there is going to be stuff that we need to understand in that kind of pillar or that domain. Just underneath that, Azure Platform as a Service offerings, things like App Service, Azure SQL, that kind of stuff is going to be in there. That's going to be a bigger focus. Azure Storage and Security kind of in the middle there. Those are going to be big concepts for us as well. Again, we're going to dive into these in more depth, along with monitoring and troubleshooting and dealing with some third-party integrations. So knowing all those things, those are kind of the high-level chapters, if you will. We'll go into the kind of low-level pieces inside of those domains. But those are kind of the things that we need to understand as we go into this. So first, some exam basics. If you're thinking about doing AZ-203, it's about 40 to 60 questions. Kind of depends on when you take the exam, that kind of thing, somewhere in between 40 to 60. The nice thing about the exams these days, like I was saying, it's changed a little bit since the old days, is there is partial credit for some of the questions. So if you think back to the long time ago, a lot of times it was just multiple choice, right? You just had multiple choice questions. Now there's different styles. You might get questions to answer something with 2 or 3 answers, pick all that apply. You might get something which is drag and drop, some kind of interactive question. So there's a different kind of formats for some of the questions, but the good news is there is partial credit. So if you get to a question and you don't know every single answer, you could possibly get some partial credit. So you want to make sure that you fully answer every question, even if you have no idea what the answer is, okay? So there's no penalty for guessing, and you want to make sure that even if you're getting kind of close to the end of time towards your exams, which actually is something that's happened to me a couple times, you get into it and the clock starts running, right? You get close to the end. If you get into that situation, you're running out of time, just do what I used to do in high school, which is when you're kind of at the end of the test, the Scantron sheets, you guys remember those? Like scratch in there? Just like B, C, D, A kind of thing, just go through it real fast. Don't leave anything unanswered is what I'm getting at. Obviously, you want to try to read every question and answer it, but that's something that you want to think about. Partial credit, that goes a long way. Sometimes you can't skip questions. Sometimes you can't go back. Kind of depends on the scenario. As you're going through these types of exams, in this new Azure world, especially in AZ-203, you're going to have different sections. Some might be multiple choice. Some might be drag and drop. You might get a scenario, like it says on the slide, or a case study. I actually like the case study scenario because it's kind of like a little bit of an exam inside the exam. You might get 20 or 30 multiple choice questions and then get into a case study scenario, or maybe more like 10 multiple choice and then go into a case study. And the case study will have a bunch of information about some kind of customer and what they're trying to do, their intent, their goals, what they're currently running now, a bunch of information, and then it's up to you to consume that information and then answer questions based on that scenario. I actually like that a lot. And so as you're going through the exams, it can kind of feel like you're changing into these different kind of models, multiple choice, interactive, case study. So it does keep you on your toes a little bit, right? One of the things that keeps coming up as well that you see on the slide there, performance-based coming soon. So what we mean by performance-based is actually hands-on. Actually going into the portal, for example, and doing the hands-on work to pass a test. So this has been a common pattern over the last couple decades. Some of the most prestigious certifications in the world require hands-on kind of performance-based certification testing. Things like Cisco CCIE, the Red Hat Certified Engineer certification, Kubernetes certifications that are out now are all hands-on. So in this particular exam, AZ-203, there is no performance-based testing yet. However, I would be comfortable doing hands-on going into it. In fact, that'd be a big part of my study strategy, and I'll talk about that more. All right, let's get into the domain objectives so we know what we're dealing with. So number 1, develop Azure infrastructure as a service. So your IaaS solutions, 10 to 15%. So that's kind of telling me as a developer, I'm gonna have to know a little bit of operations stuff here. So when it comes to IaaS, we're connecting everything together ourselves. We're working with virtual machines a lot in that model. So a fair amount of content can come from that. So we got to be prepared for that. The second one on the list, develop Azure Platform as a Service compute solutions. So that'll be your PaaS stuff, things like App Service, Azure SQL. 20 to 25% of the questions that you might get on the test. And so that, the stuff in Azure App Service, Azure SQL, all the managed stuff, that's where we're going to live a lot of the time, right? One of the things that we talk about with customers in the real world is try to lead with managed services when you can. And so we're going to spend a lot of time in this exam in there. We still have to have some understanding of IaaS resources. Moving on from there, we've got developing for Azure Storage, 15 to 20%. That could be working with storage accounts to manage blobs in Azure Storage, table storage, queues in Azure Storage. Might be working with databases as well, right? So Azure SQL and some of the things in there. We'll talk about security, which is also 10 to 15%, doing things like role-based access controls, working with Azure AD to integrate your applications with that service. Key Vault is something else that's going to be hammered on quite a bit in terms of something you need to know there, because as we know these days, securing secrets and application code is something that a lot of people don't do a very good job of, right? And so we got to make sure that we understand how to do that. Beyond security, monitoring, troubleshooting, and optimizing solutions, 10 to 15%. We'll talk about that. A lot of the stuff in there is going to be things like application insights, Azure Monitor, and so on. And then finally, connecting and consuming Azure third-party services, 20 to 25%. There's a variety of things in there that we'll get into, but messaging, different things, and we'll take you into that. So let's talk a little bit about the requirements here under the IaaS pillar. So this infrastructure as a service, 10 to 15%. So implementing solutions, provisioning VMs, creating ARM templates, that can be kind of intimidating. You just want to kind of write code, right? Build your application. Who cares about building VMs? Let the DevOps team do that, right? However, we want to be familiar with that. So I would go as far as, not just in the portal, but also knowing from an Azure CLI perspective, how do I get a machine built? How do I turn some of the knobs? One of the things that virtual machines have is, script extensions, the ability to bootstrap machines as they're coming online. Common solution when you're deploying infrastructure. ARM templates are on the list as well. Azure Resource Manager templates are the infrastructure as code solution on the Azure platform. And so the slide here, and that's straight from the domain objectives in the exam blueprint, right? The skills measured, create ARM templates. So the idea with creating the ARM templates isn't going to be writing every single line of JSON. We have in Visual Studio project templates for Azure Resource Manager deployments that will scaffold out a template for you. We have extensions of Visual Studio Code to help us build ARM templates. So as long as you know that framework, even in the portal, right, you can go into a resource group and export the resource group to an ARM template. That's another way to create a template. So you want to know the mechanics of that in a basic perspective, but you don't have to know how to write the whole template from top to bottom, because those templates are pretty verbose, right? So you just want to have a basic understanding how to do that. Some stuff in there in terms of how do we encrypt disks on VMs, things like that. But really, probably the place where you're going to get a lot of questions, as you might imagine, in a compute service. Has anyone heard of Kubernetes? Just throwing it out there. Kind of a joke. Everybody raise their hand, right? Everyone's talking about it. Everyone's excited about it. Microsoft's doing a great job of leveraging it in their Azure Kubernetes service, in the managed service. So you'll want to make sure that you're familiar with that from a high level. You do not have to be a Kubernetes expert, right? But you need to understand how to build a cluster and maybe how to get an application running in that environment. So if you look at the requirements here for this, create containerized solutions. You need to have a basic understanding of Docker and how to build container images. That might be a departure for some folks. That, if you watch social media and all the news that comes out, it seems like everyone's doing containers. But the reality is, in the field, when I talk to people, especially in enterprise customers, it's usually not as big as you would think it is. So spend the time, if you haven't done it yet, to start learning containers. And also, probably an important piece is how do I build a container image with a Docker file, okay? Which is a very common pattern in the world of Docker. But beyond that, just those basics, working with an AKS cluster, right? There is some components to that it can get kind of, if you're looking at the documentation, intimidating, because there's this cluster and the master server and all these nodes. If you know the basics of that the cluster itself has a management system and nodes that run your application, you kick the tires and you kind of play around with it, that'll be plenty. We just want to know the concept here, right? We want to make sure that we understand how to get code running in that environment, not necessarily do all the DevOps work of managing the cluster and all that kind of stuff. But beyond that, like, thinking about things like Azure Container Registry, ACR, if we're running Docker containers and app service, or we're running containers on a Kubernetes cluster, putting our images close to our infrastructure makes a lot of sense, right? Low latency, close proximity images and infrastructure. That's why Azure Container Registry is a good solution. So you want to know how to build an Azure Container Registry resource, how to put images into it, how to go grab those and run them, whether it's in Azure Kubernetes Service or in app service. So in app service, when you build web applications, one of the things you can do now is run container images. Microsoft calls this web app for containers. It's really no different than building a web app, deploying your application straight to it otherwise. So it supports both those models. I would go through the whole process of understanding how to do all those things. If you know how to build that stuff and get it running, it's going to help you answer the questions. That's another good point. When it comes to these test questions, what I think when I'm thinking about this, it's not so much knowing the question off the top of your head and memorizing information. It's more about solving problems. And so when it comes to solving problems, having done hands-on, but also knowing the big picture, the key features of these services will help you work through the problems, right? So a couple other things on the list beyond ACR there. If we're doing containers, we can do containers and app service. We can run them on our own virtual machines. We can do them on AKS. We can put our images in ACR, but we can also do Azure Container Instances, or ACI. That's a newer offering and managed service offering in Azure App Service. Basically lets you run a container when you don't have any compute infrastructure deployed. So you don't need a Docker host running on a VM. You don't need an AKS cluster. You don't need an app service plan. You can spin up a container using the Azure Container Instance service. Just tell the service, hey, here's my image, spin it up, right? Kill it when it's done, you're good to go. So ACI is an important concept there, probably is going to be widely used in the future, and it's also something that can be used with an AKS cluster. So we can use, beyond just virtual machines as running nodes, we can leverage ACI as well, okay? So that's stuff that I would get hands-on practice with. This item at the bottom, I'm also gonna give you some more tips on like how do you lab this stuff up and get hands-on practice. So I'll give you some stuff here towards the end. But check out this last item here, implement the batch jobs by using Azure Batch Services. This is one thing that I didn't study hard enough. When I went into the exam, I was like, I've never seen people using that a whole lot, so I didn't really spend a lot of time. And then I got into the exam, there's a ton of questions on it. So that's one where I would make sure that you spend some time there. If you haven't heard of Azure Batch, it's really just a way for you to spin up a bunch of virtual machines to go do some big job, right? You got all these videos you got to render, you need 1,000 systems. That's what a batch job is. So working with that in code, whether it's Azure CLI or building your own application, you want to know how to do that. Let's get into paths, talk more about app service, things like that. This is going to be more comfortable probably for us as developers. And this is fun because this is the stuff that I love to have all my applications running in. At my company, we moved all our stuff to app service in Azure. We were running it on virtual machines on another platform, and we're super happy with the way that we build and deploy our apps. So app service web apps are actually fairly straightforward, right? If you're a developer, you probably worked on this a lot because it's very easy to do a hello world application, right? Beyond that, though, there are things in app service, like web jobs. Web jobs have been around for a long time. But if you're new to Azure, you might not realize that it exists. There might not be a ton of use cases where you want to use it. However, we need to understand how it works. So a web job is something that can run on your app service plan, right? So when you do an app service plan, you've got this infrastructure sitting there, and a web app would be running on it, of course, or more than one web app. And a web job is a way for you to put a script or a program up there that leverages that compute infrastructure, that you can schedule it, you can invoke it manually. And what I would say is, as you're studying for this, as you practice that, you'll want to know what types of code are supported in web jobs. Same thing in app service plans, right? What platforms are available, right? If I'm using web jobs, I want to know, hey, web jobs can run as PowerShell scripts, Python scripts, all that kind of stuff, right? You want to know what the requirements are there. And you want to practice that, right? And along with that, things in app service that you might not use a whole lot, diagnostic logging, going in there and doing containers if you haven't been doing that. Those are things we want to know. And then getting into the mobile app stuff, that's where the story gets kind of interesting, right? There's a big thing in flux right now. Microsoft's changing a lot of stuff. App Center is becoming the place where we build, release mobile applications. There's also a mobile backend as a service. This is coming as a preview, right? And before that, there was some stuff in app service that Microsoft was offering. Now if you go into the documentation, docs.microsoft.com, you're looking at app service mobile apps, they'll actually tell you in there, hey, we're gonna move all this over to App Center. And so I'm bringing that up because it's gonna be interesting as you study based on what questions are they gonna ask you. Are they gonna ask you the new stuff, or are they gonna ask you the previous stuff? So Microsoft will never put anything that's in preview in your exam. As you're going through the portal, you'll see preview a lot, right? You probably noticed that already. Anytime stuff's in preview, it's not gonna be in the exam. For this exam, since the mobile stuff is kind of changing right now, I don't know how many questions you'll get out of that pool. However, you just wanna know, I can run a mobile backend in app service, right? They do have some things like offline sync, and ways to work with mobile apps in that system where it's changing. So I would look at the previous documentation, but really focus on some of these other things in app service as well, right? Because that's kind of a moving target. Working with API apps is also another thing that can be kind of confusing. These things are actually in the skills measured right now for the exam. If you look at API apps, Azure App Service API apps is not a resource anymore that I'm aware of that you can deploy in the portal. It used to be in there, but all they would do is build a web app they would do for any web app. The only difference between an API app and a regular web app and app service is that basically an API app has a Swagger definition configured for it. And so if you haven't worked with Swagger or the open API definition, it's just a JSON document that your API supports to say, hey, here's all the actions that my API supports, and then you can use client generators to go get that open API definition and generate an application based on that. So it's a way for us to programmatically understand how to work with a web API. So a big takeaway there is, if I wanted to build an API app, just build an app service web app, set up the Swagger definition, good to go. Functions is also on the list. I would spend a lot of time working with functions as you prepare for this exam. This is something you guys might have been working with a lot so far. New things have come out this week. So again, newer stuff obviously isn't gonna be on there if you take the exam right away. Eventually, Microsoft updates this stuff on a regular basis, so it'll pop up in there. Things like the Azure Premium plan, for example, that came out of preview this week and so on. If you look at the list here, some of the basic foundational components that you want to understand about functions, really triggers and bindings are a key concept. Especially, how do I get my code to run, right? The triggers are going to be, is it something I'm going to invoke over HTTP? Is it going to be an event that's happening in the platform somewhere? And in terms of outputting from my functions, I can use bindings that say, hey, I want to output to a storage blob, or I want to output to a queue, things like that. So understanding how do I get the input and output configured for a function, and also the billing, right? The billing model for your functions. That's going to be an important concept in this exam. They're going to ask you about consumption billing, which is just paying for code when it executes, versus running your functions on an existing app service plan, so knowing the difference between those two pricing models, right? Consumption billing versus potentially, billing an app service plan and having idle resources and paying for stuff when I'm not using it, right? So that could be something where you get in a scenario type of question, you want to pick the right billing model. We also want to know that, hey, we can go into Visual Studio. We've got project templates to build function apps from there. We can do the same thing in Visual Studio Code. And as you would imagine, in terms of code samples that might come up in this exam, you will be asked about evaluating different code samples. You won't be writing any code. So it's not like you'll have to write code from scratch, but you might get a multiple choice question where they show you different blocks of code. By and large, what language do you think they're going to be asking you about? C#, right? So I would be comfortable with C# moving into this exam. Even though Azure supports so many languages, that's probably going to be the one you see the most. So if I was going into this as a developer that's outside the .NET ecosystem, Microsoft has put out a lot of stuff lately about .NET Core, beginner stuff out there. Also, keep in mind that you might want to think a little bit about Azure CLI and potentially even some PowerShell. Just understanding how to get the command help, okay? Not necessarily memorizing every command, but how do I understand how commands work just in case you get into the exam in a situation where, hey, they've added performance-based scenarios, and now they're asking you for doing things from the command line. From what I understand, though, if you ever do get into a situation on the exam that's performance-based, I think the way that Microsoft is doing this, as long as you perform the task, whether or not it's graphical or command line, you're good. But you might get a question where they show you some CLI commands. And having done it before and messed around with it a little bit will help you work through and solve those questions. All right, we'll talk about storage here. All right, so in terms of Azure storage, a lot of good stuff in here. Developing solutions for storage tables. A lot of people don't use this a whole lot. This has been around a long time in Azure storage. However, this is a cool place to put a real basic data table for a small application, because Azure storage itself, pretty cheap, right? And you really got to load it up with a lot of data before you start noticing how much you're paying, right? So if you're just putting records in there for a basic form, it could be kind of interesting as an option for you to persist some data. But outside of that, you want to understand how to work with it from the command line and from C#, probably more specifically from C#. And when it comes to storage and some of the other services, when they're asking you about questions and how do you interact with these services in code, I would probably spend some time here with Azure Storage. If you just go out and search, Azure Storage account C#, you'll end up hitting one of the startup pages, or they call it Quick Start, in the Azure documentation. Almost every service now has a Quick Start section, right, in the documentation. And usually, those ones will cover the low-hanging fruit of what it is you need to know. So for example, storage accounts in C#, if you query that in the search engine and you end up in the documentation for that, they're going to give you a ton of different code samples, right? If you spent half hour going through that of how do I build a storage account in C#, how do I upload and download objects, how do I do a couple other things, put some stuff in a data table, all those kinds of things. That will light up a bunch of things in your mind, and when you're solving a question in the exam, that's going to help you. All right, so I would recommend that. We talk about developing solutions that use relational databases. Azure SQL obviously is going to be big in there. Knowing the pricing models for Azure SQL database, something that I would highly recommend, as well as the security controls, right? Like transparent data encryption and so on. But in terms of pricing in Azure SQL, we have lots of options, right? Up on the slide, this is straight out of the skills measured on the exam page. They talk about Azure SQL Database serverless, which a lot of people haven't even realized is out there, right? So they have a model in Azure SQL Database where the database will pause when you're not using it, and you won't pay during that time frame, right? Versus DTUs, billing model, versus vCores and all those things. So you want to understand that. You want to realize that, hey, we also got like PostgreSQL support. We've got Cosmos DB as well that's on the list here. You want to understand how to work with those two different data sets. So whether it's relational database or Cosmos DB storage, those are two things that I'd spend a little bit of time on. Cosmos DB, of course, is your non-relational database service. You want to know what APIs you can use, like the table API versus like the Cassandra API and so on. Partitioning strategies, all that kind of stuff, all the different consistency models there. And I kind of already mentioned blob storage. One thing I didn't talk about in blob storage that's on this slide is data archiving and retention. So in that model, storage accounts, depending on the type that you create, support different things. So if I create a storage account of a certain kind, if it's blob storage only, I'm not going to get support for tables, queues, and those kinds of things, right? And if I don't do a general purpose version 2 storage account, then I don't get data archiving. I don't get tiered storage, right? Which is things that we have to understand that's supported. So understanding the right kind of storage account to get the right features is a very important concept for this test. We'll do some security talks here, or discussion. I want to make sure I could try to get some Q&A for you guys. And this one, the security thing, is here's how I would tackle this. There is the whole authentication piece. How do we use forms-based authentication? How do we do Azure AD authentication? All that stuff, like you guys can find that in the documentation. You can go wire it up very simply. The things that are big on this that I would call out: managed service identities and service principals, role-based access control, and then finally Key Vault, right? So think about it this way. I've got an app service web application. I want that application to probably store and access secrets from the Key Vault, right? Very common pattern. If you haven't done that before, you want to go through the process of figuring that out. If you go to a web app resource, there is an identity section where you can create a managed service identity. This is supported in other places in the platform as well. But if you have a managed service identity for your application, then you can use role-based access control to delegate permissions to that identity to things like your Key Vault, right? So there's nowhere where you're storing credentials in your application. Not in the app settings, in the web app, nowhere. So in app service, there is Key Vault references that are supported. Give you the ability to just query an environment variable, basically, or a app settings key, and get your app service or your Key Vault secret from the system. I would go through that exercise of wiring all that up, creating a managed service identity, using role-based access control to give that identity access to a Key Vault. Okay, that'll give you a lot of clarity around the topics that are on this list. One of the things that you might have seen if you've seen some of the other exam preparation sessions, as they tell you, right? And everybody talks about this. Go get the skills measured, break it down into a document, map it up with the documentation, and make sure you go through line item by line item to make sure you understand all the stuff that's going to be on there. So any of the stuff that we don't talk about today, you'll want to do that, right, as you prepare for the exam. A couple other things on this list, and then we'll get into some tactical stuff that you can do to prepare. You want to spend some time understanding auto-scaling, right? And we have auto-scaling in virtual machine scale sets. We have auto-scaling in app service. So either way, the auto-scaling rule configuration is basically the same thing, but you want to understand that pattern. How do I go in and create scaling rules based on a metric so I can elastically scale out and scale in when I need to? I might be also doing that based on a schedule. So I want to know how to wire that up, whether I'm doing virtual machines or app service. Caching is something that you'll want to make sure that you understand. We've got Azure Redis cache that's available to us that can be used. We've also got Azure CDN as well. You want to understand how those work, go through the process of maybe setting that up a little bit, playing around with it. I didn't see a ton of that personally on the exam, but you want to make sure that you understand that concept to build basically performant applications, right? You've got some cache on Redis. You've got CDN for global applications, so low latency access to static content wherever users are in the world, all that kind of fun stuff. And then finally, at the bottom, big one here, instrumenting solutions for monitoring and logging. App service, when you build a website, it gives you application insights by default. However, even if you're not doing web apps in app service, I would spend the time to play around with application insights. Insanely good service. Side note here, one of the things on the slide, they've got load web tests, along with alerts. Alerts are important in Azure Monitor, but load testing your applications is something we've had the ability to do for a while. That's actually going away next year. So while it may be on the test, in practicality, it's going to be gone, I think, as of March 2020. All right, just a couple more things here, and then we'll talk about some strategy. So a couple other things you want to know in terms of what falls under the consuming third-party services and some of the Azure other services here that are out here, developing logic apps. So that's pretty simple, right? Building a logic app because it's all graphical. However, you want to understand custom connectors and templates. So one of the things around logic apps is when you're pointing a logic app at a custom system, right, outside of the logic app framework where they've got all the templates and connectors for you to use, you can use your own as long as you're pointing to an API that supports the open API definition. So you can literally build your own web API and app service with the Swagger definition and then point a logic app to that thing, and it would know, hey, here's all the stuff that we can do. And so you can build a logic app that would graphically go through and allow you to use an API. So you want to understand that framework. You want to work with Azure Search a little bit. This is one that I haven't seen a ton of customers leverage personally in the field, So as I work with developers, usually I find that most people aren't aware of this service or work with it much. Spend some time with that of building a search index, understanding how you import data into it, how you query it. Event-based solutions are going to be something that, even for this exam and further down the road, just in practical terms in the industry, is going to be huge, right? So working with the event grid service to subscribe to events and then send that event data off to, whether it's functions, Azure notification hubs, event hubs, that kind of stuff. Building those event-based solutions, you want to understand how to do that. And then finally, messaging, right? How do we build loosely coupled architectures, have a messaging system in between application tiers, whether that's with Service Bus or the Azure Queue Storage? If we're doing queuing using Azure services, obviously Service Bus is going to give us way more bells and whistles. However, it's important to note, you can do queuing in Azure Storage. So you want to know what's the difference between those. So I'd go through and set that up. How do I submit messages? How do I retrieve them? And what are some of the mechanics to that, right? Doing it in code, actually doing it in C#. All right, so let's get into the tactical stuff here. How to prepare. So Microsoft Learn obviously has been something that, if you're here this week at Ignites, Microsoft's really pushing this. They're doing a great job of adding tons and tons of content into this. And so here's what I would do. Number one, right? Let me take you over to this screen here. Here's the exam page. Let's see if it comes up. There we go. Let's see. There it goes. All right. The exam page here. So, the URL's on the screen, but if you just simply go out and search AZ-203, you'll get to this page. You'll notice that the exam pages are now under Microsoft Learn. But check this out. Down here, here's your skills measured. You download the skills outline. It pretty much is going to cover line by line all the stuff that we just talked about, and sometimes that'll get updated. So you want to keep an eye on that. If you're watching this as a replay in 2 months, or if you're not going to take the exam this week or this month or anything, I would double check the skills measured, because you never know when they're going to update it. However, down here, this is the important piece. Check out the learning paths, right? So tons of stuff here. All of the labs, basically, that are in Microsoft Learn, I would do these before I go into the certification. So I would get the skills measured, I would go through the documentation, I'd hit all the bullet points. Is there any gaps in my knowledge? When I go through that bullet list, and then I close those gaps by going to the documentation, playing around with stuff. Then, or maybe in parallel, depends on how you want to do it, go through all these. All of these different labs and lessons and things that are in Microsoft Learn. Not only is it content, text, and videos that you can look at, but there's going to be hands-on practice in a lot of these, where you get an embedded cloud shell working in one of Microsoft's subscriptions to go through and perform these tasks. And I can tell you from my own experience, the content in here is actually it's a lot deeper than I was expecting. You'll learn quite a bit by going through this. So those are the first two things I would do. The last thing is going over here, look at the official practice tests. I would do a practice test of some kind. This is the official one for Microsoft. The thing that I like about these is that gets your mind in that pattern of solving problems, but don't worry about practice exams, because sometimes they're not very close to the real exam, and sometimes they're harder than the actual exam, or sometimes they're full of mistakes, depending on who you go with, right? The thing is, you want to get into the habits, or kind of the practice of evaluating the question, trying to think of what they're asking you. One of the things that you get in a Microsoft exam, right, that can be very particular is the terminology. And so you want to read very carefully, because one or two sentences at the end can change the outcome of what your answer is going to be. For example, you might get a big question, and the last thing is, how can you do this with the most or the least amount of administrative effort? How can you do this with the most cost-performant way? And sometimes those two different things can change what you were going to say for an answer, right? So you want to think about that as you go through this, but practice exams help out with that a lot, okay? But I believe that hands-on practice is really the best way to go for a lot of these. Let's switch back over here. So we covered that. A couple other things here. The community. outside of the things that are on this slide that I've pretty much talked about so far, community interaction is always a good thing. You know, if you're out there on Twitter, Reddit, those kinds of things where people are talking about their experience of the exam, you may pick something up that'll help you ask or answer a question. So I would encourage you to get involved in the online community. If you just, are watching the hashtag on Twitter for Azure, you'll see lots of people talking about the exams and their experience. In case you didn't know, there was some credits here this week for scheduling a free exam. So there was a voucher for taking an exam here this week and one after the event for up to 6 months. So keep that in mind. We do have microphones at the front row here, so I will take questions at this point. The only other thing I'll add to this talk here is one of the things I see people doing that's kind of, I would say, an anti-pattern when it comes to these certifications. They're waiting a really long time because they're worried about over-preparing, right? So you only got to get a 700 out of 1,000 on a score to pass the exam. So I would say to you that you may not feel ready, and that's okay. Like, I used to worry about, oh man, I got to pass it on the first shot. But Microsoft has offers, or their partners have offers now as well. When you take an exam, you might be able to get a replay, right? Depending on how you purchase the option, right? So take it, see what the feedback is. You'll get your results. It'll tell you in all those pillars or those domains how you did. You might find out, oh, I'm weak in security. It's cool. Take it again, right? So don't worry so much about that, but mainly, set a date, throw a date out there 4-6 weeks, chip away at the skills measured, get your hands-on practice, and you only got to get a 700 out of 1,000, okay? So questions. Let's do a little bit of Q&A. Let's see how much time we got here. So I got about 2.5 minutes. Put my contact info up on the slide so you guys can reach out to me if you have any questions. Any questions so far about this? And you can also shout it out, and I'll repeat it if you don't want to walk up to a microphone. Any questions? Yes?
You mentioned taking it, you have to take it again. Is there a certain limit to the number of times you can take it?
There is a limit in terms of how long you can take it again, so you got to wait 24 hours. Yep. The other thing I didn't mention that I will say is, or at least I'll go back to a little bit, is I might have mentioned it, but I really love taking this stuff remotely. So if you have the option to do that, that's a real nice option there. What else? Other questions? All right, you guys, thank you so much. I'll be around after this session, so if you want to walk up and ask a question, thank you very much. Good luck on the exam.